Well, hello all. According to my phone, we've reached the magic hour of 7:45. So I'm going to get started with just brief introductions about myself and our presenter for this evening, and then I'm going to turn it over to our presenter. So my name is Sharon Dittmar, and I'm a congregational life consultant for the Mid-America region of the UUA, who brings you this webinar this evening thanks to your gifts to the annual program fund. So those of our congregations, we ask every year that you give a certain amount, and if you give all that we ask, it is considered fair share, and we're very grateful because it is those funds that bring you these events. So thank you to those of you who contribute. We appreciate everything we get. This webinar is being offered because I was telling Jim earlier, who I was chatting with from Wisconsin, that a number of our smaller congregations had said they struggle sometimes to figure out how to honor and recognize their members and loved ones who have died, and we're looking for some resources. We know that there could be other reasons for you to be on this webinar, and you are all welcome to be here, and we are actually delighted that you're here. So what I want you to know is that our speaker for tonight, which we're thrilled about, is Erika Hewitt, the Right Reverend. That's me being, putting a little levity in. She's really a reverend, but Right Reverend sounds fun to me. And Erika is a minister in Maine, and she does a lot of weddings. I just saw. I bet you do a great wedding, Erika. She's the editor of Braver Wiser, which is a weekly spirituality series, and I'm actually going to put the link to that in the chat box. I actually get it every week. I really enjoy it. I've read a lot of great material from it. You might enjoy it as well. And she is our UUA Minister of Worship Arts. And so we're grateful that Erika has agreed to present to us a webinar on tending our grief. And so now I turn it over to Erika.
Ooh, thank you, Sharon. Thanks to all of you for showing up. This is wonderful. I just want to say how privileged it is, I feel, to be here visiting from the New England region virtually into the Mid-America region. For those of you who missed it, if you have a question, a comment, or even if I happen to mumble or I say something and you don't catch it, we are asking you to please put it in the chat box. Sharon is monitoring that, and she will interrupt if I need interrupting, and I will pause to make sure we get that. I'm pretty good at staying on time, and so I've planned tonight to leave time at the end to discuss your questions, your comments, as well as just checking in with Sharon throughout this. But I want to warn you, it's a great thing this is being recorded because I have a lot of information to share. I have winnowed this down to what I believe are the essentials. That being said, it's a lot, and I will move at a fairly brisk pace. And again, the recording will be here. I'm going to make one suggestion slash piece of news, which is that I have, I'm going to mention books throughout this webinar. I have them right here. At the end of the webinar, I will hold them all up again. So when I mention a book, you might want to stay here and stay present to the conversation rather than going off to pursue it. That's just my suggestion. You do what you want, and away we go. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. And here I go. I am now employing technology. This, oh, I see what I have to do. Just a second, folks. I'm going to put this away, and now I'm going to do this. Much better. This is a webinar I have intentionally titled Tending to Grief. You'll find out why that term has particular resonance, and honoring death. As Sharon mentioned, I am half-time your Minister of Worship Arts for the UUA. So when you have, you may have follow-up questions that may come to me but may go to Sharon. This is what we're going to do tonight. If you need to leave, by the way, fear not. The recording is happening and you'll be able to find this. The first thing I want to do is offer up my affirmation of shared ministry. Almost everyone watching is a lay person. There are some clergy on this call, but there are actual teams of you sitting out there. So I'm going to affirm shared ministry. I'm going to get us all on the same page by talking about the language we use. I am going to talk about tending to the bereaved and the pastoral imperative of working around loss and death and grief. I will talk about liturgy and the process of, that's just my name for how we craft a service that has an arc and a shape and depth and intention behind it. I will mention eulogies and say a few things about those. I will then, as the sort of the third piece of the third imperative of this work for anyone doing it, is theology, which is about how do we talk about the things that matter beyond our understanding, and theodicy, which is the very fancy $25 word for why do bad things happen. And I'll just mention some of throughout, but I'll end with talking about what this requires from us, we who do this work, whether we're clergy, whether we're seminarians, whether we're lay people. And as I said, I will make sure that we have time at the end for questions and conversation. So let me just pause and ask Sharon. Sharon, am I good to keep going, or do you need to interrupt me at this point?
You get the thumbs up to keep going, no questions yet.
All right, I'm gonna keep going. Here we go. Now, I just want to go, let me back up. And I want to, before we talk about language, I want to talk about shared ministry. This is the term that we use in the congregation I serve half-time as pastor. The way I would describe shared ministry is that we are all tending to one another. We're all caring for one another. We are all embodying hope and compassion to one another. We are all leaders in some way. I have long been a visible and vocal advocate for the fact that that lay people, lay ministers, lay leaders have tremendous gifts, wisdom, authority, power. And so I want to make it clear that I am especially grateful and respect all of you who are showing up as lay people, wanting to be part of the shared ministry, regardless of whether you have a professional minister or not, rising to that call. In terms of other language, I do want to just do a brief little survey and tell you what I think we usually mean when we say certain things. You don't have to use these terms in this way. This is how I'm using these words. A funeral is a service, and the connotation is usually that a funeral happens very, very soon after a death. It usually happens within a week. And usually when the word funeral is used, it refers to a service where the body is present, a casket is present, a coffin is present. A memorial service is far more common in our Unitarian Universalist world. And the connotation of that for me and for many clergy is that the body is not present. Maybe the cremains are. That's a portmanteau word, the cremation and remains. There might be an urn, but there is not, the body is not present. And a memorial service might be held within a week, but it's not unusual for a memorial service to be held 10 days later, 2 to 3 weeks later, or even months after a death. I'm about to get into this with a little more detail, but a celebration of life is the term that I hear and many people use when it's planned by those, the survivors, who want to focus on the story and the life of the deceased and not spend a lot of energy on the loss that's left behind. And a graveside service and or an interment of ashes is usually a separate event. It's usually held, it's often held in addition to a funeral or a memorial service. It can be held by itself, and this happens at a cemetery, at the graveside, Or it could happen in a columbarium, and that is a special repository for cremains. It looks almost sometimes like a very beautiful, elegant, fancy set of little cabinet doors. So this is probably not full of many surprises for you. What I'm going to do now is start to talk a little bit more about language. And this is where I'm going to start just inviting you to be maybe challenged or start to offer some more thought-provoking material. I was very intentional about asking other UU ministers how they feel about the language we use around death. And there are a great number of us who feel that when someone has died, it's important to name that. It's important to say, this person has died, there has been a death. And there are others who feel that, you know, that's important, but it might be more important to honor the preference and to mirror, to echo, to use the language that the surviving family members use. But if you start working with a family whose loved one has died, you will notice that some of them almost cannot bring themselves sometimes to say the words dead, death, or died. And it's something that I'm not going to tell you what to do or what to think, but I invite you to really think about it and reflect on it. And if you're part of a pastoral care team, have a conversation about it so that you're doing this work, so that you're doing this mindfully and you know what to listen for. Of course, there are many, many euphemisms for death. And I will say that sometimes those euphemisms can be very, very misleading. There's nothing misleading about the term dead. There's no way to misinterpret that. There are many ways to misinterpret other words. I once went to the nursing home to visit my 85-year-old parishioner, Tom, who I love dearly. And when I went in, the nurse said, "I'm so sorry, he's not here anymore." And I almost started crying. And she said, "No. What I meant was he's not at the nursing home today." So we have to be aware that this is about emotional comfort, but sometimes there are many benefits to using plain, clear, real language. Now, I want to offer a challenging thought from my colleague Cecilia Kingman, who serves our congregation in Edmonds, Washington. We hear a lot about celebrations of life, and in her opinion, she says, and I tend to agree with Cecilia, a celebration of life is not appropriate unless the deceased truly is at the end of a well-lived life. But if this person who has died was young, under 70, let's say, people don't just want to celebrate. What they need is to mourn. And making room for grief, rather than rushing to celebrate, quote unquote, is a pastoral imperative. And it is also my experience, as it is Cecilia's, that the concept of a celebration is often grief avoidance. So part of what we do in the aftermath of a death is we help the grieving face their loss. This is an important part of our work. So I am going to, loosely speaking, posit that in the aftermath of death, the ministry that we do, the shared ministry, is pastoral in nature. There is a liturgical element. To me, that is the service, the components, and the theological component that I mentioned earlier. So what I'm going to do is go through each of these. And just as a reminder, your questions, even if it's to clarify something, your thoughts, whatever, are welcome in the chat box, and Sharon is monitoring them. I cannot read the chat box, so just know that if you do ask a question or make a comment, it's possible you will not hear us address it immediately, but we will make time to do that. So let's stay with this idea that our response is, oh, before I get into the pastoral, it would be so lovely if these three interwoven pieces were tidy, if they happened in a sequential order, if we only had to deal with one of them at one time. These are truly interwoven. They are layered together. And I'm really stripping this down by even limiting this to 3 areas. So this is, as I start with the pastoral, in no way to suggest that we do one thing first and then we stop and we shift to the other. I just wanted to put these in this order because I think it demands the most of us, frankly. So let's talk about the pastoral elements of this shared ministry. Reverend Kate Rohde says memorial services transform the experience of mourning. Well, how is that so? How might we be agents in that process? 2 books that I think are excellent, but are very, 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 very different. And you don't have to rush off and start looking for these. You will see these again at the end, and this has been recording. Try to stay with me. Megan Devine has published this book. It's brand new. It's Okay That You're Not Okay. Her website is Refuge in Grief. Megan Devine speaks to 2 sets of people who are in grief and people who love someone who's grieving. It's Okay That You're Not Okay is the best book I have ever read about the nature of grief, whether we're in it or whether we're observing someone else who's in it. And I will go into the ways that she is offering up almost heresy. She is offering up, to me, revelatory thoughts that invite us to engage this in a new way. A slightly less reverent book, and very different book, is by the greeting card maker, Emily McDowell, and it's called There Is No Good Card for This. And I will, by the end of this time, the slides, will circle back to Emily. So what I want to impress upon you is the context in which we're doing this. Our culture is grief illiterate. The culture in which we live and breathe and learn and function is illiterate when it comes to grief. These are a few quotes from Megan Devine's work. She says, our models of grief are broken. And despite what many experts believe, there are no stages of grief. Despite what the wider population believes, there are no stages of grief. We do ourselves a disservice when we trot out Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages. Her work was centered on a small population of hospice patients who were themselves nearing death. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, after her work sort of blew up and took the world by storm, expressed regret that she had, that her observations had been transformed into a suggestion that there are 5 stages of grief that everyone goes through. So if you have learned that, as have I, we get to unlearn that. We get to let it go like an environmentally safe helium balloon that we're letting go of and let it drift up into the stratosphere so that we can tend to what we know now, which is that our models of grief are broken. One of the ways that our models of grief are broken, this is not on the slide, is on our culture, we love redemption stories. Brene Brown talks about this, how much we just love seeing someone pull themselves up and redeem a hard experience. That too is harmful for someone who is stuck in the tar, in the mud of grief, and does not have any timeline or stages that are neatly and tidily laid out in front of them. One of the real hallmarks of our grief illiterate culture is that people view grief as a problem. We view it as a pathology. We view it as the exception, and we should fix it so people can get back to a happy state. This is a broken model, because if we think grief is a problem to be solved, Megan Devine says, our tools will fail us. And so the first step in doing work around death and loss and grief, or any kind of crisis, is to understand that grief is not a problem. And it's not a problem to be solved. It's an experience to be tended. So if memorial services are a way for us to transform mourning, we are not transforming it by saying, well, we're going to create something to help you feel less sad. That's not what we're doing. My understanding as a student of Megan Devine's and as a pastor is that we are preparing ourselves to tend to someone else's grief experience, for which we should have no expectations of a timeline or stages or promises of redemption. I am not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm just going to move through, but sometimes people who have gone through crisis or grief refer to ring theory, which arose from an LA Times article 6 years ago. And what this essentially is about and shows is that when someone is suffering, they're at the center of a circle of, at the center of outward expanding circles of community. And the premise of ring theory is that the care goes inward. The tending goes inward. The support goes inward, from the more peripheral members of community to the more inner circle, to the inner circle, to the inner circle, to the person who's suffering. And if you are having difficulty, or you're feeling weary, or you're feeling frustrated, you don't, they say dump out. You don't process that with the person who's suffering or the people in the innermost circle. You process your own response outward. We do not put another burden on the people who are either suffering or the closest to the people who are suffering by asking them to use their emotional energy to help us deal with our questions or our wondering or our problem or our frustration. So we are allowed to have that experience. We're allowed to say, oh my gosh, this is reminding me so much of when my grandfather died, and it's bringing up these sad memories. But we don't take that processing toward the suffering, grieving person. We take it out so that we leave those people with their fraying, depleted emotional resources to tend to that grief, not take care of us. Right? So you're hearing that this work places an emotional burden on us. We start to shoulder things willingly without asking the people we're serving to take care of us, which is why it's important to have systems and self-knowledge about how to do that taking care of. So in a book that is written by a Christian pastor, and I will again show these all to you at the end, Lee Franklin is a very savvy pastor who's written these, goes by she, her, Practical Guide to Funerals. And there's a lot in this book that needs translating, and there's a lot of gold. And one of my favorite things about this book is Lee Franklin's naming the 5 tasks of grief. When someone is grieving, the tasks of grief are to accept the reality of the death, to express grief around the death. This is why I quoted Cecilia Kingman as saying, should we jump straight to a celebration, or are we avoiding something? To make meaning of the deceased's life and death, to adjust to a world in which the deceased is no longer present, and to redefine the relationship with the deceased in terms of memory, legacy, and love. I think these are beautiful. In my experience of being a minister for almost 20 years, this is very, to me, true. It rings true. And I think this, if we understand these tasks of grief, it helps orient us as the helpers, as the guides, as the pastoral care team, as the leaders. It helps orient us tending to the experience of grief. Sharon, can I keep going, or do you need to jump in?
I just have one comment from Jim who says, "You make a lot of sense, Erika. When I lost a grandchild, all sorts of people talked to me about their loss. Not helpful at all when I wanted to talk about my loss."
Right. Yeah. And we'll get to this. I have a fairly hard-hitting section of slides later. So anyone who's gone through a great crisis or death knows that our fellow human siblings have so many good intentions, and that does not in any way automatically mean that their good intentions end up making us feel good. So I'm going to keep moving ahead, and I'm going to remind you, as I start to shift and talk about the liturgical aspects of this ministry, I'm going to remind you that pastoral work will be ongoing, that it will be, it will kind of enter the picture and leave the picture, and that work is never really done. And some of my liturgical notes that are about to appear reflect those 5 tasks of grief. So let's look at those one more time. Let's go along with Lee Franklin and buy into understanding that we're helping people accept the reality of death, express grief around the death, make meaning of their life and death, adjust to a world in which they are no longer present, and redefine the relationship with the deceased in terms of memory, legacy, and love. Okay, so the bad news about the liturgical aspect of shared ministry for memorial services is that it's not really about finding the best words. I mean, it is about words, but it has much more to do with presence. So I'm going to come back to that and ask us to hold the both and. Okay, there are 2 Unitarian Universalist books. They're not both published by Skinner House, but when it comes to learning about this, I really love In Memoriam by Edward Searle. Sarah York, who is a retired UU minister, she's not retired. Remembering Well is her book. It is much more narrative than Edward Searle's book, which is much more concrete examples. Sarah's book sometimes has a different cover. Again, I will show all of these to you at the end of near the end of the webinar. So what might go into a memorial service? How would we put one together? What I'm about to take us through is one way to do it. I am going from the assumption, since you are here probably because you're connected to the Mid-America region, I'm going from the assumption that you are a Unitarian Universalist, that you will be applying some of this in your Unitarian Universalist congregation or community. So I am coming from a UU-centered viewpoint. I will also say that you will see different orders of service, different formats. I'm not saying this is the right way, the only way, or the best way. I'm saying that this is what I tend to use with slight modification. And I'm going to tell you what each piece does from a relational purpose viewpoint. When we offer a welcome and opening words, we are combining 2 things. we are combining that pastoral presence, bringing in some of what I've already discussed, and we're also weaving in some practical things. The wonderful thing about memorial services is often the people who attend come from a range of communities. There may be people there who really did not want to set foot in a church of any kind. There may be people there who have only ever been to a Catholic Mass. There will be Unitarian Universalists there. So one of the things we want to do as a gesture of hospitality and almost diplomacy, like we're an ambassador for our faith, is we want to put people at ease and help them know what to expect. That's what I mean by practical. I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to actually come back to this page after I take a detour down Opening Words Avenue. So hang in with me while I show you a sample set. Now, Catherine Sanghas has adapted these words from James Ishmael Ford. I'm just going to give you a moment to silently read these words of welcome. Now, if this were me, either immediately below that third paragraph or between the first and second paragraph, at some point I would say, my name is Reverend Erika Hewitt. I was Dorothy's minister. I continued to be the minister to her husband, Sam. This service today will be simple, but tender. We will share some songs, we'll hear some poetry. You will have a chance to share your memories if that's what you want to do. In deference of this time, which I would call sacred, that will never come again, I would ask you to please silence your phones. And I invite you to get comfortable and know that your presence here is so very important. Welcome. So I would weave in some of that. But I want you to see the way that Catherine and James, however this wording came into being, is saying, our task is to face full and unafraid the reality of her death. These words name grief and loss. These names say what we're here to do. These words offer hope in some ways. And I should also say that from the very beginning of the service, if you are leading it, you need to understand, even if you've stood up in a worship service to do a reading or to offer your own sermon, if you are relatively inexperienced, this is not the time to be self-effacing or to shirk verbally or non-verbally your authority. This is not the time to try to get people to meet your own needs and expectations, right? So I'm going to stop sharing just for a moment. And I just, because I want to, I think you can all see me. I want to, there we go, say a little bit more about what I mean by this, because it's a very ineffable aspect of leading services, but it's crucial. Sometimes when I see inexperienced worship leaders, I get the feeling that they have needs that they're trying to get met and that they're holding the congregation responsible for those needs, which is very unfair. So that might mean, oh, I'm really, really nervous here. I want to feel more at ease. I want to make people laugh so that I feel more like they like me. That's something that you can work with and practice with other team members on your own. That's not appropriate for worship, and it's certainly not appropriate for a memorial service. So self-effacing comments are also a way that people try to inauthentically and dishonestly divest themselves of authority. Comments like, well, I'm not really playing any role here. I'm just here to make sure, blah, 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 blah. It can feel very intimidating and it can feel very scary. And it can feel very risky and vulnerable to embrace the authority of the role and to become a channel for the power that starts moving through the space. But if you aren't aware of that, it may take you by surprise, and you may respond in ways that kind of feel that get in the way of the intention of the service. So that was my little homily about that. May I go back to the slides, Sharon, or do I need to? I would say, could I, only if there's a question. I'd like to leave the comments for later if there are comments. Should I keep going?
You're great. Keep going.
Okay, here I go. Da-na-na-na-na-na. So we we took this little detour. I'm going to go back to this. Whoop. How about I do that? I'm going to go back to this sample liturgy. We have welcomed people. We have put them, we hope, at ease. Whenever I do a Unitarian Universalist memorial service, I not only light the chalice, but I first tell people what we're doing. There will be, always assume that there is someone who has no idea what Unitarian Universalism is. So we provide context for non-UU guests. My personal preference is to have the congregation read in unison some words of chalice lighting. I like the words by Albert Schweitzer in our hymnal. Our light goes out sometimes and is rekindled by another person. We each have reason to think with deep gratitude of those who have lit the light, relit the lamp within each of us, or something like that. My preference is then to have arranged for a family member to come up and light the chalice while people are reading. It means there's less attention on them. Everything in the service we will have come to an agreement on. And because people are grieving, especially family members, we have to be ready to change the plan at a moment's notice, because people in grief either sometimes forget the plan or realize that they simply cannot do it, and that's okay. Somewhere in the beginning of the service, where we're still naming the larger circles of belonging, the connections and relationships that hold us together and hold us to the deceased, I don't ever ask the family members to stand, but I do like to name for the people present who's there. Because if you think about it, I just went to a memorial service 2 weeks ago, and I decided to sit like near the back. And I couldn't see anyone in the first 2 rows, but I knew that Sally's 7 grandchildren, adult grandchildren, were there. But I couldn't see them because all I could see was like 8 rows of people sitting in front of me. So I like to say, these are the people who are here today, who you will see at the reception. Again, and I list them names, the relationships. I say, again, they are so grateful that you have come to be with them today. Sometimes it's nice after that talking to have some music. It might be a hymn. It's kind of dicey sometimes to have hymns if you anticipate a large percentage of guests who are not UU or not churchgoers, because unless you know that the song can be sung with, let's say, zest, it's unless it's a standard like Amazing Grace. But if you have 70 guests and only 15 of them know Spirit of Life, the singing of Spirit of Life becomes a sonic picture of who's an insider and who's an outsider. And we want everyone to feel welcome and included. Lee Franklin, and the picture of her book is there, so I'm going back to the Christian pastor who has wonderful ideas, has this beautiful suggestion in her book about including a ritual that honors the deceased and involves grievers. So an example might be, let's say someone was renowned for her quilts, and let's say their fabric trunk is open at the front, and there are all kinds of scraps of fabric. A ritual might be during a song, anyone who would like to can either come forward, or baskets are passed, and you can select a piece of fabric to take with you into the world. Or maybe the person was a gardener, and everyone receives a seed packet or a seedling, and you're reminded to continue the impulse for life and for living and for growth by taking your seed or seedling and going out to enrich and beautify the earth. I don't often do a ritual like that, and it's a beautiful way of including people who wish to be included in some way. What I do then, and we're still quite near the opening of the ceremony, the service. I mean, we're really maybe only 10 minutes in. I like to offer the eulogy early on. Not all people do. I call it remembering, let's say Sally. It's the memorial service that I attended in a UCC church. Remembering Sally. Eulogy comes from two Greek words. Eu means good. Logos actually means speech. So a eulogy means to speak well of. It means sometimes to speak honestly of in gentle ways. I will say that a eulogy is not the same thing as a timeline of a person's life. It's not really just facts. It's not really the same thing as an obituary. I'm going to again take us on a little detour down eulogy lane and quote from Ed Searle's book, who says one of the many intentions in a memorial service is to speak honestly of the deceased in a eulogy, so the loss and intense feelings have a fair representation of their source. My eulogies usually last 5 to 8 minutes. A eulogy is, at its best, a naming of the patterns and shape and motivating forces of a person's life. Again, Lee Franklin's book has the best guidelines on eulogies that I have ever read in terms of questions that you ask friends and family members to get at what drove and shaped and contributed to the becoming of that person, not just what year did they graduate from school and what year did they move to, Albany. After any sort of speaking like that, it's nice to provide the space of music, of nonverbal, let people be alone with their feelings and memories. It's often the case that a family member will say, well, I want to get up and sing a song. I always think to myself, I'm not sure you'll be able to. So you have to form a plan B with them. Okay, I would love to have you play your violin. If you become overcome or it feels too difficult, please know that the accompanist will have some sheet music and can play instead, so that you can take care of yourself. I then, only after the eulogy, have designated speakers, and just to get at the practical, and I need to move briskly. It is very, very important that people know who's going to speak in advance and that they write their comments down. I prefer to see them first. I always tell people, I'm sorry, for the sake of holding the space, I need you to understand you cannot speak spontaneously. Most people have no idea how long they've been speaking. Most people don't know that if they write something down, 100 words is more more or less a minute, sometimes less. But if someone says, well, I wrote a few words and it's 900 words, no, that's going to take a full 8 minutes to deliver. And if you've asked 4 people to do that, it's hard on those in attendance. So I'm going to leave that there, but there is a sort of delicate touch that goes into gently and pastorally wielding your authority if you're leading the service in terms of preparation. I'm going to set aside the whole topic of the open mic, the so-called open mic, where people are invited to come forward and share memories. I could do an entire webinar about that. It can go very well. It can go not so well. I may leave time for Q&A during Q&A for that. But this is a lot of listening. And so the responsive reading, to close that up, a responsive reading can really create a communal shared experience. 2 responsive readings that work well, I'm sorry it disappeared from the slide, are We Remember Them and George Odell's We Need One Another. They're both in our hymnal. I'm going to keep going. I believe that the power of the silent meditation and prayer at the end, near the end, is for you as the leader to use your voice and your words to do about 4 things, maybe 3 of these things. In your words, you're going to offer thanks for this person's life, for the gifts, for the legacy. You're going to put meaning making in your own words. That's the theology piece that's coming in just a minute. You're going to say something, not an answer. You're not declaring what everyone has to believe, but you will in some way offer up what that person believed, or what their family said they believed, or what maybe you know from your relationship with them. You might in that prayer request comfort for those who are grieving. And you might, in your own words, call the community to loving action of ongoing care. The nice thing about these 4 things is you can do it regardless of your theology. You could do this as an atheist. You could do this as a humanist. You could do this as a full-blown, this person loved reading the Bible. Lee Franklin calls this the prayer of commendation. So in the Christian tradition, this is asking God also to receive the deceased in mercy. Do you have to do that? Nope. But that's what people who are not who come from the Christian tradition might be expecting to hear. I always like to extinguish a chalice if it's been lit. Closing words are brief. A benediction is asking people to go forth, trusting that life is good and sweet despite its pain, and we're here to take care of each other. You will be tempted to pull out all of your favorite poems instead of putting these things in your own words. I would suggest that this is a very powerful opportunity to do ministry. And it makes me sad when instead of closing words, someone reads 3 very long poems, which is beautiful, but it's someone else's words. So the logistics of a service, and I'm going to move through these very, very quickly. Don't forget that someone has to be holding the reins on all of this. Who's providing music? Where's the reception? Who's going to set it up? Who's in charge of that? Will there be photos and mementos? They're lovely to have either up front on the chancel or back at the door or in the reception space. Where are those going to be? The order of service or the bulletin. Who's going to create it? Who's going to print it? Is the family prepared to form a receiving line? That can be absolutely draining. It can be absolutely life-sustaining. It can take a very, very, very long time. Put out tissues. Put them out. give people permission to feel their feelings. A box of Kleenex or those little purse packs scattered everywhere, that is, or a pocket pack, that is a concrete invitation for people to feel their feelings. If they are not necessarily grieving the person whose life and death are being remembered, they might be connecting to the stories of death in their own lives and their circles of love and concern. So this is often a place where people get to bring, as Mary Oliver says, the soft animal of their body, and how it loves what it loves. Another logistical piece, and I'm going to be quite firm to the point of being harsh. Yes, you need a microphone, and you need to use the microphone. And if you say, I don't need a mic, you're wrong, and you are erasing the needs of a whole section of people who might have very real disabilities. So if you or someone you know says, no, that's okay, I don't need to use a mic, they are saying, I'm deciding what people in row 10 can and can't hear, or I'm letting my discomfort make a decision on behalf of all. So on Worship Web, there is this blog post. It's gone around the world 45,000 times. And this is a great thing. If you have people in your congregation who say, I don't need a mic, this is a good way to get them to understand, yes, you do. You need to use the mic. End of story. I mean, unless there are 3 people standing on a beach, okay? I'm talking about the typical situation. Okay, moving right along, because time is a ticking. I want to, and I'm right on schedule, my own plan here. I have touched briefly on the pastoral aspects of responding to death. I've touched on the liturgical. I want to remind you that part of our work, clergy or not, is theological. Paul Waddell is a Christian theologian. This quote is actually on Worship Web. This drives much of what I do as a pastor. Hope has to be seen to be believed. It has to be made visible. It has to be something we can feel and touch. We have to be each other's partners in hope. That does not mean we need to feel better now. It does not mean we have to get over it. It doesn't mean we have to say, I'm going to give you a year to feel better. It means I will hold the hope for you when you cannot. And I'm not going to do that with platitudes and saccharin and a little magic wand. I'm going to do that by being real about the nature of pain. So I'm coming back to Megan Devine's book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And one of the best books about theodicy, it was published 2 years ago, is by Kate Bowler. It's called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. Let me remind you that our role when we respond to pain is to do no harm. And we do harm despite our best intentions when we parrot things or say things that we might believe, but that can do damage to a hurting heart. One of the things that is very, very damaging in the wake of pain is to say everything happens for a reason. Now, you might believe this, and I might be challenging you. You might feel defensive. You might feel affronted. Let's pause. I want to go back to Emily McDowell's book that she wrote with Dr. Kelsey Crow. She is famous for her empathy cards that she sells. She went through cancer treatment or leukemia treatment when she was a young adult, and I've heard her speak about this in person. And one of her most famous greeting cards is, please let me be the first to punch the next person who tells you everything happens for a reason. So these are sold by the millions because anyone who's gone through suffering knows what it's like to hear this. So this is pop culture. This is secular culture. but we're going to get back to the theology in a moment. Something else that's harmful to say in response to pain is, well, everything will be okay in the end. And if it's not okay, it's not the end. That's not true to someone who's suffering, because we can't know that. This is part of God's plan. This is a theodicy. This theology suggests that there is a master puppeteer with a map or a star plan who has decided that what we really need to do is go through this, and we've been singled out. They're in a better place. Not helpful. I know how you feel. No, you don't. Even if you've suffered the exact same loss. Your wife of 40 years died. Well, hey, my wife of 40 years also died. So I know how you feel. Don't say it. It's not about you. And you don't know. Everyone's grief is unique. Things will feel better eventually. You know what? They might feel better eventually, but you don't say it. You don't say it to someone in the days or weeks or even months following crisis. And as Jim has already sort of alluded to in the comment box that Sharon reported, we don't make this about us. It's human instinct to say, oh, well, you know, when my aunt died, this is how I felt. Well, we're trying to relate. What we've done is we've taken the focus off of the person in pain, and we have now made the conversation about us. So in her book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, Kate Bowler says, the only thing worse than saying this is pretending that you know the reason. I've had hundreds of people tell me the reason for my stage 4 cancer. Because of my sin, my unfaithfulness, God is fair, God is unfair, my aversion to Brussels sprouts. No one short of reasons. So if people tell you this, make sure you're there when they go through the cruelest moments of their lives and start offering your own. She's a little sarcastic in this section, but she says when someone is drowning, the only thing worse than failing to throw them a life preserver is handing them a reason. And likewise, Megan Devine says much more flatly, there is not a reason for everything. Not every loss can be transformed into something useful. Things happen that do not have a silver lining, and we have to start telling the truth about this kind of pain. So what I am inviting you to do is, maybe you have covenant groups, maybe you're part of a book discussion group, maybe you're on a lay pastoral care team. Have these conversations with the people in your communities. Read sections of the book. Challenge one another to talk about how we as Unitarian Universalists, and how you specifically make meaning and respond to pain. Why does pain happen? Why does suffering happen? How do we get through it? These are things that even a seasoned minister might struggle to articulate. But if we don't try, we risk automatically falling back on phrases that could feel not just hurtful, but harmful to those who are grieving. The last thing I'll remind you of, as I hinted at earlier, is this is a quote from Lee Franklin's book. Whatever our story is, our whole life, everything we've known, experienced, loved, lost, that story intersects with the stories of others in this process. The process of responding to pain, tending to the experience of grief, putting together a memorial service, holding the space for people to grieve, offering responses about how the world works and the nature of that mystery. And so she says it's important to come to grips with our own death experiences or lack thereof, and how we cope or haven't coped with them. We have to know, to be, like, use modern parlance, we need to know that there are triggers. We could get triggered. We have to know how we will care for ourselves and who we will go to process that if it happens, so that we don't start dumping in on those rings. I have perhaps left your head spinning. And yet I told you I was good at ending on time. I would like to segue into having some conversation and addressing the questions and comments, but I'd like to do that by showing you the books once more. And let me just, in no particular order, I want you to, sometimes it's nice to see what they would look like in your hands as opposed to just seeing a picture. It's okay that you're not okay. This is Megan Devine's book. Her partner died in front of her suddenly, and she was tired of people saying dumb, hurtful things to her. This is There Is No Good Card for This by the greeting card designer Emily McDowell. It's just very kind of fun and colorful and kind of hard-hitting. Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved is Kate Bowler's experience of going through stage 4 cancer and being public about it. This is The Practical Guide to Funerals. You can see it's not very thick. This is the one that's Christian and will need you to have some gears switching in your head. And then these two square books are the Unitarian Universalist books, In Memoriam, much more sort of laid out, concrete. Here's some examples, here's some steps, here's some samples. And Sarah York's Remembering Well, oops, sorry about that, which is much more sort of narrative and reflective, and yet offers some lovely insights. So I can now read the chat box myself.
Well, let me get back to a question that was from a while ago that I held for you, which was, how long should the sharing memories section go in the order of service?
Yeah. You know, I never assume that a memorial service will last an hour. Sometimes, depending on how many people are present, a memorial service might go over an hour. But when people get very nervous and anxious is when a memorial service has lasted over an hour and there's no end in sight. So if you know, so I should say, I just taught a seminary class on this, and I had my students as their assignment write a memorial service script. And it was very cute, is that some of them put 6 pieces of music into the memorial service, not realizing that that was half an hour of music. So if you know that the rest of the service is about half an hour and your eulogy is about 6 minutes, it's nice to ballpark. You know, the sharing of memories should maybe not go over 20 minutes. Now, if you have 2 family members and they each want to speak for 10, this is where you start sort of talking with them about what they really want, because an open mic will sometimes result in many people who want to speak. Most people speak very briefly during an open mic, but sometimes people are very reluctant, and only 2 or 3 will come forward, and then there might be a pause. And what most families are afraid of, I'm kind of answering more than you wanted to know. What most family members are afraid of is that the leader will say, anyone, 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 like that Ferris Bueller, that iconic, like Bueller, and they're afraid that it will be treated with an air of desperation as an acknowledgement that no one wants to share a beloved memory. So that's one of the pitfalls and delicacies of this. I think altogether 20 minutes is a lot of sharing of memories. And sometimes you need to get up and say, I'm sorry this has to be the last one right now. Don't forget that the reception is a great time to tell your stories, and that the family will want to hear these memories. They'll want you to call them up in the days and weeks to come.
So I'm just going to go to one more comment from Charlotte, and then this is my last one. So if someone else has a question or comment, you can add at the bottom. Charlotte, first of all, thinks this is terrific and says thank you, and then says, a ritual I did once was with stones and water. People were invited to write a word on a stone or not and place it in the bowl of water. The family took the stone home.
Yeah, I think ritual, when Lee Franklin refers to ritual and I talk about ritual, it's not spoken. Right. So as soon as you invite people to speak, things slow way down. But yes, stones could be candles. You want to always consider the fact that some people have mobility restrictions. Not everyone can or wants to get out of a chair or a pew and move forward and come back. So there are logistics like in that way. And you should always, I always try to make it clear that it's okay for people not to participate in any element. Jim, I want to address Jim's question. The back of Everything Happens for a Reason has an Appendix 1, which is 8 things. The title of the section is Absolutely Never Say This to People Experiencing Terrible Times. And there's 8 things. Appendix 2 is called Give This a Go, See How It Works. And it's a short list of things. And my favorite, which I meant to put in the slides, is, oh, my friend, that sounds so hard. I'll just read this. The weirdest thing about having something awful happen is the fact that no one wants to hear about it. I'm going to repeat that. The weirdest thing about having something awful happen is that no one wants to hear about it. People want to hear the summary, but they don't want to hear it from you and that it was awful. So simmer down. She's talking to the caregiver, the minister. Simmer down and let them talk for a bit. Be willing to stare down the ugliness and sadness. Life is absurdly hard, and pretending it isn't is exhausting. So that's just one of a few things she lists, but often being present, allowing silence. If someone you know is going through a terrible time because of illness, I know when I went through cancer a few years ago, the thing I loved most was getting care packages. And the thing I loved most was the people who sent them and then never followed up, forcing me, like, did you get it? Did you get it? Did you get it? Wanting something back from me. So the most generous thing you can do for someone who's in crisis or grieving is to give and offer without expecting acknowledgement, thanks, your casserole dish back the next week, whatever it is. And to, let them say no if they need to say no, but not to then create more energetic work for them. I want to just acknowledge that what I left out of the logistics, what I left out of the process is that it's important. One of the reasons I like it when a memorial service is not right away is to have time to sit down with the family, maybe more than once. There's someone who's unmuted. Sharon, could you mute yourself for just a second? Please, thank you very much. Here's a tip that it took me a very long time to learn. If you have a planning or just caring for meeting with a family who's in the wake of a death, try to do that in a private space, maybe your office, maybe the church. If you attempt to do that in their home, chances are there will be a nonstop string of interruptions. The phone ringing, a neighbor dropping something by, knock on the door, they got to let the dog out. Oh, they got to let the dog back in. Oh, there goes the phone again. Or people will be so not wanting to engage that they will get up and leave the room, which is in a way them taking care of themselves. But sometimes they'll say, oh, I'm just going to go make a sandwich. And then you've lost a family member and everyone else just came to a decision. And 15 minutes later, that person comes back and now wants to undo the decision that you made while they were gone making a sandwich. So having people in a different space than their home will help those meetings happen, get this important work done. I want to go back to Jane's question. And maybe Jane can elaborate, but I can't tell if this is about secrets and about truth telling, but Jane's question is about ongoing grief in a largely white, straight community of people of color or queer people. I am going to interpret this as a reminder that people with marginalized identities, people of color, disabled people, LGBTQ people, there are many marginalized identities, move through the world differently than people with lots and lots of privilege. They move through a world where they're constantly being burdened with oppression, with systemic oppression, with judgment, with being asked to explain themselves, with not being seen, with not being heard. And it's wearying. And so there is sometimes a collective grief or weariness that they bring into a situation where people with lots of privilege, I'm a cis woman, I'm straight, I'm white, I'm middle class, sort of like are like, well, what's I don't know about that. What's the problem? So I don't know, Jane, if I have sort of interpreted that correctly, or I don't know if you're talking about how to process it in community. Yeah, I will say I would not want to lead a webinar speaking for or about marginalized identities, because nothing about me without me. That is not I do not have the authority to do that. But I think that Sharon would be very interested in following up with you to hear more about that, because Sharon and the Mid-America staff is so clearly attentive to the needs and requests of all of you. So thank you, Jane, for being brave enough to put that question in there.
I think we have about 2 minutes, and Hannah had an interesting question at the end.
Oh yeah, a different model for service for kids. Yeah, let me first take a big step back from Hannah's question to say something that might be intimidating but might be reassuring. Even as clergy, we proceed with utmost caution when the death has to do with a child, when it has to do with completing suicide, when it has to do with addiction. Those are very, very complicated, huge issues. And if there's more than one of those, it's okay to feel like you're in over your head and say, I don't know that I have the skills to help. I would love to connect you with someone who can hold this with the honor and tenderness that's called for. I have done that. Now, that being said, kids, it's really hard. And first of all, they're somewhere else developmentally. Second of all, depending on the age of kids, there are some different families talk about these things differently, right? So as adults, we all know that people die. Children may not have experience with that. They may be all over the place in terms of knowing what it feels like and knowing what that means and what does that mean and what do we believe in our family about that. So I don't feel like I have anything very helpful to say about this. But I love the fact that Hannah has witnessed many, 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 many children, and taking the time to let children talk about their sadness. I wish I had something wiser to say, but I think Hannah's observation is it. I used to be an educator, but I do not consider myself a religious educator, and I'm not a parent. So I don't have the chops to take that question any further.
I can say something about that.
Yeah,
if I'm allowed. I did like a year-long theology class in Rudolf Steiner theology and working with children. And one of the very best ways to handle grief or any major upset with children is through a healing story. And if you Google healing stories, they are stories that you tell. You do not say, I am going to give you a big lesson now on healing, and you don't do some long. You just tell the story. And I have a friend who has written some for me, and she and I are even thinking that we should maybe take this idea further, because sometimes I've preached with them for the Time for All Ages and put up the pictures from my drawings. But they're magical because you tell the story that is about the grief or the death of something else. It might be an animal, it might be a fairy tale, whatever. And you can even tell the same story for days in a row if it's a situation that's not a memorial service, but is something else.
That is so
it's
great.
an amazing, amazing transformative spiritual practice to do with children. It blows my mind how effective it is.
Healing story.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you. I am going to, I see that Sharon and I both wanted to end on time, and we haven't quite accomplished that. I want to thank all of you again. I am E. Hewitt, or I'm just worship web at uua.org. Sharon is S. Dittmar at uua.org. And I want to thank all of you on behalf of the people you will serve and the people who will benefit from your learning and processing. And just thank you again to Sharon and the Mid-America staff for inviting me to do this.
And thank you, Erika, for your wonderful service and ministry to all of us. Thank you so much. And we appreciate your suggestions about webinars. We can't always do all of them or find the right presenter for all of them, but we always consider them. So thank you so much if you want to reach out. And thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Have a great week, everyone.